Hello, everyone, and welcome to a Vivit SIG webinar. The title of our presentation today is The Payments Ecosystem, Security Challenges in the 21st Century. Beep. Brought to you by Vivit Security and Privacy Special Interest Group, or SIG. So the team that supports this LUG, or our special interest group, is a global interest group focused on security, and it's managed by Samal, Jamal, and Yul, all over the world, that coordinate this event and bring content like today's security presentation to you today. Next. My name is Rocky Pisto. I'm the Vivit Engage Coordinator. Been an active Vivit member for actually over 20 years now, and it should be fun today. I've seen this presentation. I think you're going to get a kick out of it. So, next. And today's speaker is Philip Smith. He's the Distinguished Technologist and Senior Product Manager and Architect at Micro Focus in the voltage area. So we'll hear a little bit about that, but mainly it's going to be about credit cards and debit cards and those kind of things. Next. So this is a live event. It's being recorded so that if you didn't make it today on the call, you'll be able to reach out at a later time. Anyone that's registered for this event will receive an email with the recording and all the Q&A related things. And speaking of Q&A, please type your questions in the question panel. And if we have time, we'll get to them today, or Phil will get to them after the webinar, and it'll be part of the package of the recorded webinar that we send to you as a follow-up. Next. And here's the place in the webinar control panel where you can toggle that red arrow back and forth to see all the options you have. And there's an area for questions and chat. And you can type your questions in here, and we can determine if we can get to them now or down the road. Next. And with that, I will pass this on to Phil Smith, and have a great webinar.
Thank you, Rocky. Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. As Rocky says, I'm Phil Smith. I've been with this company, in my mind, for 12 years now. And we were an independent software vendor till 2015. Then we got bought by HP, and then HP split into HP and HPE, and we were part of HPE, and then we got sold to Micro Focus. So here we are at Micro Focus. I like to say I have the best job in the company because I'm technically in engineering, but I'm dotted line to product management and to sales and to support and to professional services. So at any given moment, there are 3 or 4 senior managers who think I'm doing something for another senior manager, and sometimes they're all wrong. But it means I have my fingers in a lot of pies and have a lot of fun, have a lot to do. Today we're going to talk about payments. This is not a product pitch. We'll occasionally say, and we solve this problem. But that's about all. All I'll say about voltage is that we do encryption. We have some interesting encryption technology. If you want to, you can go to voltage.com and learn about it. And that's it. So here's what we'll talk about today. We'll talk a little bit about the history of payments, how things work today, what happens when you actually swipe a card, some kinds of card fraud and how those happen, and then where this is all going. So let's look briefly at the history. The first payment systems, of course, were barter-based. Actually, I might have these two backwards because chickens used to be expensive, so maybe we should have it like this. Eventually, the concept of value was abstracted from things to money. And some money larger than others is this island in the Pacific called Yap, where they have these huge stones that they use for money. These stones actually change hands, although they don't usually move. There's actually one on the bottom of the ocean that was being transported in a canoe, and the canoe sank. And they still consider it money because they know where it is, so it can still change hands, even though nobody's seen it lately, sort of like your 401k. Gradually, coins replaced barter. Typically, coins were made out of precious metals, gold and silver. Using precious metals meant you didn't have to worry about them being fake, assuming that you could tell what precious metal was versus pot metal, or who had issued them, right? An ounce of gold from Greece was as good as an ounce of gold from Rome. But back then, there were no foreign exchange fees to worry about either, of course. But coins were still kind of heavy, especially in bulk. When you had a lot of money, it was a pain to carry around this big bag of money. And also, of course, that was easy to steal because it was anonymous. So the idea of a check, which is from a Persian word, seems to have originated during this unpronounceable empire. And of course, there weren't any drive-through teller windows back then, but they did have banks. And so checks were originally used to make it safer for merchants to carry large amounts of currency with them when they traveled around. And they were more secure because unless you could convince the bank that you were, Ahmed, the goat merchant, you couldn't cash the check even if you stole it from him. The Persians weren't the only ones to think of checks. Over the centuries, various other groups used the same idea. In 17th century England, banking and commerce got to the point that checks became more common. This picture shows the oldest known surviving check from 1659. As you can see, originally checks were handwritten. That, of course, led to fraud again. So pre-printed forms came into use. You would go to the bank to get one of those, sort of like a cashier's check today. And bankers would meet each day to exchange checks that they'd received during the day and settle up. And this is called clearing, and they would meet in clearinghouses. And that's a term, clearinghouse, that's still used today, although, of course, now it's computers talking to each other. MICR, magnetic ink character recognition, was developed to allow automated check clearing. The magnetic ink is readable even if someone has written or stamped over it, folded, spindled, or mutilated. And it's much more reliable than optical character recognition, although if you've done check deposits by ATM or phone, you're probably pretty impressed with how well they do with handwritten checks. MICR has a very, very low error rate. There was an early scam exploiting MICR. Somebody printed up some fake checks that had one bank's name but another bank's routing number on them. The routing number tells it which bank they go to, and they deposited those checks. The checks were routed to the bank according to the MICR, of course, but back then checks were still processed by hand at the banks. So they get a stack of checks, they're going through them, they get one that says it's from some other bank, and they say, oh, routing error, so they put it back in the system. And the checks went around and around and around until they physically wore out and somebody noticed the discrepancy. And meanwhile, the time limit for the checks to clear had passed, and the scammers had taken the money out of the bank and vanished. I don't think nowadays that wouldn't work the same way because, well, presumably they put some systems in to look for it, but also nobody would be physically looking at the checks, so they would notice it when the bank account number didn't work. So the fun fact that checks don't have to be on official forms to be valid. They just need to have the right set of attributes, a payer, a payee, an amount, an account, a date, and so on. Back in 1995, a man named Patrick Combs got one of these scam mortgage checks. It looked like a check, felt like a check. What it really was a come on to get a second mortgage. And for a joke, he deposited it. And then a couple of days later, he went to the bank and he had $95,000 in his account that he didn't think he should have. Even though it had that disclaimer on the front, that apparently doesn't mean anything. They had accepted it. And then he was clever. He put the money in an escrow account, but then the bank got rude with him, and then they screwed up and didn't do anything within the time limit. And technically, the money was his. He did eventually give it back, but it's kind of an interesting story. If you Google Patrick Combs check, as it says on the slide there, you can waste a half hour or more of your time reading about it, and it's pretty neat stuff. So the payments landscape has changed a lot today. There are now lots of alternatives to checks. Most of us have used PayPal, or we pay bills online. When Wells Fargo bought Wachovia, they pushed free online bill paying on me. And I resisted it at first, but now I love it because it saves me time and postage. Plus my handwriting is terrible. ACH, or direct debit, is how you likely get paid. Your employer transfers a pot of money to ADP or the equivalent, and they put a pittance in your account. And Giro is not only the name of a tasty lunch item, but it's the name of a British system originally and became generic in Europe. It's from Greek gyros, circle, and it's referring to the circulation of money. Same thing as ACH. Then there's direct debit. That's the inverse of ACH, where you authorize your mortgage company to take each month's payment directly from your account. So we're going to focus on credit cards, so I'll talk a bit about debit cards as well. And finally, of course, there's also cash. You'll notice that cards, credit plus debit, massively outpace cash already. But I'm not sure what other is at the far right. I guess that's chickens or goats. So charge accounts go way back. Historically, of course, they were between you and a single merchant. You know, they were down at the corner store or whatever. And charge cards don't offer credit. You're expected to pay them off every month. They were just a convenience to avoid you having to carry a check or cash every time you went to the store. And some of those were prepay, kind of like a debit card. Credit cards let you carry a balance from month to month, and of course, also you get to pay interest. And you may be surprised to learn, I was, that the idea of a credit card goes back well over a century. I mean, this is exactly what a credit card is. It's kind of neat. So non-merchant specific charge cards existed before the 50s. There's a charge plate at the top right. They were typically confined to an area like the downtown merchants in a given city. And if you can see the notches on the top of that charge plate, those would correspond to a given merchant. So if you had an account at Wanamaker's and Macy's, but not at Gimbel's, then you'd only have 2 notches, and the notch for Gimbel's wouldn't be notched. So if you went there and tried to use your charger plate, it wouldn't fit in their machine, so they'd know you don't actually have an account here. Not very secure, but it worked. Diners Club allegedly came into existence because a man forgot his wallet and was embarrassed when his wife had to pay for a meal. Now, I'm not sure how Diners Club would have helped, because presumably it would have been home in his wallet, but that's their story from their website, and they're sticking to it. Amex started in 1850 as an express mail company. I'd always wondered why it was called American Express. It was founded by the same guys who founded Wells Fargo, which is kind of an interesting legacy, 2 huge companies. And then Amex expanded to money orders in 1882 and invented traveler's checks in 1891. So when Diners Club came along and showed signs of being a success, the Amex card was an obvious next step. The same year Amex was born, Bank Americard was introduced by Bank of America. Now, Amex cards were true charge cards back then. You were expected to pay them off every month. But Bank Americard was a credit card offering revolving credit. And that caught on, and they licensed the mark to other banks. In Canada, Visa was called ChargeX until the mid-70s. I still remember a little jingle because I grew up there. Will that be cash or ChargeX? Shook, shook. And that last sound was the sound of the card imprinter, this machine, which is how if you're old enough like me, you recall card transactions being recorded. And that's called a zip zap machine, or a knuckle buster in the business, by the way. And even Amex eventually caved and offers true credit cards now. So most debit cards can be used as both signature debit and PIN debit. If your ATM card has a Visa or MasterCard logo on it, like the one here, then you can use it as either. The difference is that PIN debit takes the money out of your bank when you do the transaction, although of course the merchant still doesn't get it right away. Signature debit is closer to a credit card. The system verifies your credit is good, and unless it's a huge amount, it allows the transaction right away. But the actual transaction gets settled when the merchant does settlement, typically that evening. We'll talk a little bit more about settlement later. Gift cards are really just prepaid debit cards tied to a specific merchant, and they're administered by one of the big boys in the industry, MasterCard or Visa or Amex. Because after all, you didn't really think that little mom and pop restaurant around the corner had its own infrastructure to manage gift cards, right? So we all know what happens when you swipe a card, right? At least we think we do. This is how you know this joke. Man walks into a bar, swipes a card, and I used to think this is what happened. It would go to Visa, and that was it. That's not actually correct. I'm going to digress for a moment and talk about some more terminology. The acquirer is the bank from the merchant's perspective. The merchant gets paid for the charge by the acquirer. He doesn't get paid by Visa. He doesn't get paid by Chase or whoever it says on the card. The processor actually processes the transactions. The card swipes go through the processor to the brand, to Visa or whoever, in real time. Now, to you, the consumer, it doesn't matter much, and often the acquirer and processor is the same, although they don't have to be. And then there are incestuous relationships, like Chase is an issuer, but there's Chase Payment Tech, which is a processor, and Elevon is a subsidiary of US Bank, and so it gets very blurry. Brand is easy, that's Visa, Amex, MasterCard, Discover. But then again, it gets blurry because Amex is both a brand and an issuer. There is no bank behind Amex. Amex is it. So that's a recurring theme here, is this lots and lots of these incestuous combinations. And then finally, there's the issuer. That's the bank. Your Visa card probably says Chase or Citi or something on it, and that's the actual issuer. So the small merchant card transaction is almost as simple as I imagined, or it can be. There is some processor/acquirer upstream of the merchant between them and the brand, and they pass the transaction onto the brand, and it goes through the brand to the issuer. After all, Visa really doesn't want to maintain 100,000 phone lines in case every corner store in America tries to process a charge for a deck of smokes at the same time. And they also don't want to deal with tiny merchants like that. And the merchant also wouldn't want to have to use different machines to talk to Visa and MasterCard. So the processor/acquirer is a good thing in that context. So instead, the Heartlands and Elevons and Chase Payment Techs of the world are intermediaries. They sell the store a merchant account. If you've been to Costco, you've probably seen they sell Elevon terminals and merchant accounts, and in return, they route the transaction. So as you move up the food chain to a larger store, things get a little more complex. So at the high end, Walmart, Target, and so forth have pretty sophisticated point of sale terminals. Those talk to a controller system, typically in the store or at a regional data center or a central data center, and that system may pass the transactions onto a switch or a gateway, which then goes finally to an acquirer and eventually to the card brand, who pings the bank, and so on. But again, all these combinations exist. The controller might be combined with the gateway, or the acquirer might serve as all of those, and so on. Of course, there's tons of jargon in this business. Card not present is a payments term that means what it sounds like. It's a transaction where there is no physical card present. This includes any kind of online transaction or phone transaction. And phone transactions used to be called MOTO, which stood for mail order/telephone order, but now we just say CNP. Online can include third-party shopping carts, which makes things more exciting when you're in the middle of a purchase, and all of a sudden you look at the URL and it has nothing to do with the store you started at. So card not present transactions are considered to be at higher risk for fraud, as they should be, since there's a little less tie to the actual card. Excuse me. So the card brand, remember that's Visa, MasterCard, and so on, manages the transactions, including asking the issuer to okay them, but eventually the charges do wind up at the bank. I say eventually quite deliberately. When you swipe the card and buy that latte or sandwich or flat screen TV, the merchant's point of sale terminal does talk to the issuer in most cases. Certainly it does for the TV. It might not for the latte. But what it gets back is an authorization. It validates that authorization validates that the card is active, and it marks off the amount, or a putative amount for things like restaurants or hotels, against your credit limit. And there's a term there, more jargon. The difference between your credit line and the amount that is charged plus the amount blocked is called your open to buy. So that evening or the next, the merchant does settlement, which means all the pending charges are bundled up and sent to the bank. This still goes through the acquirer and the card brand, but the actual charge doesn't truly exist until settlement. That's why if you've ever been in a restaurant and they've already taken your card and something happens and you talk to the manager and he says, I'll take that off. He doesn't need your card again. He's just going to go back and delete that entry from the batch. So when they do settlement later, it'll go away. It'll never happen. And if you go home and look, you'll still see the authorization against it, but it will go away eventually. So if the merchant never does settlement, the authorization will eventually expire and the card brand will remove the blocked credit from your account. That usually only matters if you're close to the limit and you have, let's say you got $400 of credit of open to buy on your card and you rent a car for a couple of days. So even though that car might only be $100, Hertz is going to block maybe $300 against your card. And then you go to your $200 hotel and you're thinking, well, 100 plus 200, I'm fine. But now the hotel wants to block 300 also. And so it won't go through because the combined authorizations are greater than your open to buy. So let's look at what's in a credit card number. There's some structure to it, which you've probably noticed if you've looked at your cards. So the entire number is known as a primary account number, or PAN. PAN is, nobody ever says credit card number in the industry, they say PAN. The first digit is the MII, or major industry identifier. Visa is the easy one. If it starts with a 4, it's a Visa, period. And you can see some of the other ranges assigned here. Actually, 2, I just found out last week, it says future use, but I believe it's MasterCard is now using 2. And I know I said first digit, and some of these are more than one digit. MII says it's one digit, but clearly it can be more. So the processor uses this information to decide how to route a charge to the right brand. And if you're wondering, JCB is Japan Credit Bureau. It's a big bank in Asia. And I don't know what these 9s are. They're used by national standards bodies. So that's, you know, some country-specific use. Maybe they do credit for like food stamps on them. I don't know. So the first 6 digits, including the MII, make up the IIN, which is issue identification number. It used to be called BIN, and everybody in the industry still calls it BIN, but officially it's called IIN. I don't know how many Chase Visa cards start with 430587, but I know mine does, and certainly the inverse is true. Any card starting with 430587 is going to be a Chase Visa. So if you recall my Costco Amex I listed before, it starts with 3715. So the 1 means it's a personal card, the 5 means US dollars, and all Amex are 15 digits currently. Diners Club and Carte Blanche are 14, all the other rest are 16, and they're going to 18 soon because they're running out of numbers, amazingly enough. So my wife and I both have cards on the same Amex account. And while if you look, lots of references say that the 12th through 14th digits are the card number within the account, it's actually 13 and 14 as far as I can tell, because mine is always 00 and hers is always 01. And digit 12 is a replacement code. Every time they replace the card, it gets incremented. Mine was up to 7 on my Costco Amex before Costco and Amex had their divorce. So anyway, what's interesting about this variance in format across brands is that it means the actual card number isn't in the same place all the time. That is the actual card number, your account number, it's the middle part. But what is consistent is that if you have a partial card number, but without the digits 7 through 12, you don't have an actual account number. So that middle set of digits is the real account number, the part that makes my Chase Visa different from yours. It's the only part you really need to encrypt according to PCI DSS, which is the payment card industry data security standard. It's a set of rules created by a cross-brand group to improve card security about 10, 12 years ago. And PCI DSS mandates things like regular audits. It specifies what data you can and cannot store and what you have to encrypt. And it has teeth. It's not a legal thing, but if you're not PCI DSS compliant and you get their attention or fail an audit, then they can fine you. And if you don't pay the fines, then they can say, fine, you don't get to process cards anymore. So that's pretty significant to most merchants. And then finally, there's the last digit. That's a Lund checksum. It was invented by an IBM scientist in the 60s, and it's also called a mod 10 checksum. And yes, those are valid checksums for those made up numbers. It's pretty easy to implement. It's like 20 lines of code, and people get all excited about it when they first hear about it, but all it is there for is to catch data entry errors, as it says. It's there for card not present, to avoid processing card numbers that were entered incorrectly with a single digit wrong or 2 digits swapped. Obviously, you can make up valid card numbers, and if you swap digits badly enough, you probably wind up with a valid one, but most of the time it works. And then there's a magnetic strip or stripe on the back of the card. You wonder what's in there. Does it include your credit balance? Can you hack it? No, not so much. Also invented by IBM in the 60s, the mag stripe was created for use by the government for security systems, but then the payments industry picked it up for credit cards. So being even older than I am, it has even less memory capacity. There are 3 tracks of data on it, but they include basically the same information in different formats, with flag bits and marker characters to tell you which format and so on. And really, it just duplicates the information on the front of the card, your name, the PAN, and the expiration, although they do put a few things on the strip that aren't on the card and vice versa to make counterfeiting a wee bit harder. And there are some card applications that actually rewrite the mag stripe. They use this to track things like how many times an invalid PIN has been entered, so you can't just keep trying PINs at different ATMs, or fleet cards for like truckers will record have them enter mileage when they swipe the card, and it'll record that and send it back to the home base. So the fact that small merchants still use dial-up is one factor that keeps the industry from using higher capacity mag stripes, although of course that's evolving rapidly now, because nobody wants to wait for a megabit of data to transfer over a phone line. Cards with embedded chips, which we'll also talk about, have some more capacity, but the same bandwidth issue applies. So there's all this infrastructure, right? There's swipe machines and POS terminals and networks and acquirers and processors and gateways and card brands. And obviously, somebody's making money here. The brands divide merchants into 4 tiers. Tier 4 are smallest, Tier 1 are largest, and all have the same security requirements, but the higher tiers have to go through more tasks to satisfy the brands that they're compliant with PCI DSS. And that includes very serious audits that are done regularly. So the merchant pays the acquirer per transaction. This is called the interchange rate and varies by industry, by track record, sales volume, and sales size. It also varies by processor. This is one way gateways help merchants by routing traffic to the processor with the lowest rates. So, if you're Target and you're doing, well, I don't know about Target, but I know that the Costco near me does $150,000 a day at least in business. So if they can shave half a point off transactions, that adds up. That's worth doing. Those interchange rates are why the tiny shop on the corner has that hand-lettered sign that says credit card minimum $5, because he really doesn't want to pay 40 cents on a 59-cent purchase. Traditionally, the merchant agreement that he had with his acquirer and the card brand forbade him from enforcing any minimum, but there was some legislation, actually 11 years ago now, that allows them to require a minimum of up to $10. There are other businesses like McDonald's that pay a fixed percentage of the total charges, which is why they can afford to take a card for a 50-cent fruit pie. And since a given business may deal with more than one acquirer with varying rates, that automatic routing, least cost processor can be pretty significant. PIN debit is usually cheaper for the merchant, and so they may try to push you as a customer to use that method of payment. They'll say, "Oh, just put in your PIN, use your debit card." That's called steering, and that's a violation of their merchant agreement. Although, if you're dealing with a minimum wage clerk who's been told to do it, obviously you're just beating up on him. So it's not a lot you can do. But you can call 1-800-VISA-911 or 1-800-MC-ASSIST or whatever the equivalent is for Amex and report it. That allegedly does something, although it doesn't exactly call in an airstrike. As the slide says, the big bucks come from interest on revolving credit and late fees. And that's why Amex have traditionally been accepted at fewer stores than Visa, because they do less revolving credit, so they charge a higher interchange rate to make up for it. That's changing though. About 6 years ago, I think it was, Amex changed their stance, and a lot more stores like Trader Joe's started accepting it. This diagram comes from a government accounting office document on rising interchange fees a while ago. It shows who makes money off transaction. Percentages, of course, vary, but this is a valid illustration. So in this example, the cardholder makes a $100 credit card purchase. The merchant submits an authorization transaction for the $100. The total fee for that is $2.20, and that's taken at authorization time, not settlement authorization. So the card brand talks to the bank, approves the transaction, and transfers $98.30, which you'll notice is not $2.20, through the card network to the acquirer. That's the $100 minus the interchange fee. On top of that, the card network pays the acquirer, the acquirer takes another 50 cents out, so that's where the other 50 cents goes. So the merchant gets $97.80, the issuer bills cardholder $100, and the cardholder pays the issuer. So if you return something to that little tiny store, even though you returned it, it cost him some actual money. He didn't just not make a sale. So I said I'd talk a bit more about debit cards. I used to use a book of checks a month, and I think that was pretty typical. Now I use fewer than one a month. There's the Girl Scout cookies in the spring, and there's the guy who cleans the windows twice a year, and maybe one other merchant, and that's about it. So PIN debit has passed not only checks, but credit cards as the most popular way to pay for things in terms of number of transactions. It's even rivaling cash. And of course, debit transactions are priced at a fixed cost for transaction instead of a fixed cost plus percentage. And it's lower typically than credit cards, and that's because they're lower risk. They know the money's there. The risk of you vanishing without paying is basically zero. So when debit cards were introduced, banks hated them because they thought they'd lose all that lovely money they make off overdraft fees and interest. Well, they still don't make any interest, but the reality is that debit cards are attractive to young, less affluent folks who don't have credit anyway, and so they wouldn't have credit cards. But the banks had a brilliant idea. Let's allow debit overdrafts. That makes my head hurt because it sort of goes against the whole definition of debit, but they did it. And so that's how your $5 Starbucks becomes a $40 cup of coffee after the overdraft fee. Then they had another brainstorm when they processed signature debit transactions. Remember, those get processed, settled in the evening, like credit card transactions. They'd process them largest to smallest. And that let them maximize those overdraft fees. So let's say you had $500 in your account, and you went and got a $10 breakfast and $5 coffee and $40 groceries, and then spent $4.99 on a TV. You'd expect to pay one overdraft fee. But by processing largest to smallest, they could charge you 3 overdraft fees, which is really sleazy. And so as of a while ago, banks are required to make overdraft protection on debit opt-in only instead of just defaulting to it. And they lost the lawsuit recently over the largest charges first thing, so that may change too. So the threat landscape in payments is constantly changing. Let's talk some about how card fraud happens and what you can do about it. The first category of fraud is simple. It's somebody has a physical card that they shouldn't. You lost your card, somebody found it and said, oh, quick, I'll go buy something. The second category means stolen card numbers, like those from a breach or things like that Match.com subscription you can't seem to cancel, or the waiter who charges a higher tip than you actually gave. Counterfeit cards are made using stolen card information. They can rewrite the mag stripe on another credit card or sometimes even on a hotel key card. If you Google American Underworld credit card theft, as the slide says, you'll find a YouTube video of 15 minutes about how easy this is, a reporter talking to a carder, a guy who does this, and they even go to a store to use the forged card, and it's pretty entertaining because the carder almost gets caught. He's using the reporter's number, so it wouldn't actually be technically fraud, but it is pretty entertaining. Identity theft means taking out a credit card using someone else's name and information, which they've somehow gotten, probably from a breach. This is especially nasty because you won't even know about it since they're going to send the bills to their own PO box. And if they're really smart, they'll pay the minimum monthly and person unpaid credit, and you say, what? So that's nasty. Identity creation, that's the harder, but people can do it, and then credit card up again and vanish. That's really a form of what's called bust out. If you remember The Sopranos, there was an episode called Bust Out where they took over a store and made him buy stuff. And what bust out means is buying a bunch of stuff more or less legitimately that you have no intention of ever paying for and then walking away. Finally, friendly fraud, a term I love, is the name the industry uses for purchases by folks who then claim they never received them. What, that big screen TV? I never got that. I'm not paying for that. This happens more than you think, although presumably you can't get away with it too often. And it gets real gray if they delivered it but you never got it because somebody stole it from your porch, then you're going to make the claim against the card and they're probably going to honor it unless it happens too much. So, I mentioned skimmed information. Here's a picture of a card skimmer. Now that piece the guy's holding will fit right over the credit card slot and read the card as it's inserted. So, hang on. Sorry, I had to cough. So the user will have no idea that anything's wrong. He won't even say, this ATM is busted. That one's pretty good. A lot are less legitimate looking. But you say, what about the pin? Well, at the top is a different skimmer. That piece of gray plastic that was glued on has a pinhole in it that you may be able to see. And on the back is a little tiny camera. And so it would see you enter the pin. At the bottom is another pinhole camera hidden in the light fixture on the ATM. You might spot the top one, but I don't think you're going to see the bottom one. So a camera like that plus a skimmer will get them everything they need to clone your debit card and empty your account. The good news is that's easy to get around. That's why modern ATMs say to cover the keypad while you enter your PIN, just in case somebody's got a camera somewhere. There's also a very common skimmer called a Lebanese loop, which is just a piece of folded metal that lets the card go into the slot, but doesn't let the machine eject it. So if you don't notice this thing sitting there, you put your card in, you can probably even do your transaction, but then the card won't come out, and eventually you give up and walk away, and the crook comes around the corner and pulls out the skimmer and your card. So the bad news is there are keypad overlay skimmers too. I hope you can see this animation. This is a Verifone terminal with an overlay skimmer that looks just like the original terminal. My bet is that a Verifone tech, if you handed him this terminal, would kind of feel there was something wrong, but he wouldn't know exactly what it was until he tinkered with it a bit and got that top to pop off. So you wonder how such a skimmer would get in place. Well, watch this one. The guy in blue distracts the clerk. Clerk turns around and his buddy pops the skimmer out of his bag, snaps it on, done. I'll let that run through again. Extract, pop, done. That's pretty easy. So for literally 30 years, I've heard that the card industry doesn't care about fraud. And that's not strictly true, but it's sort of true. And when you look at the numbers, you'll see why. You know, in 2015, it's hard to get current numbers because it takes a while for people to publish them. But in 2015, in the US, we charged $3 trillion in credit cards. Their revenues were a tenth of that. Not bad. And fraud was $7 billion. Okay, that's significant. But they lose a lot more on default and bankruptcy, so that's what they're more worried about. So breaches are interesting to the industry, but more because they make buyers nervous than because of the actual stolen merchandise and lost money. You know, they don't want it to go up, but they're not panicking over it. This whole issue of customer confidence is huge to them. They don't want people to be afraid to use cards. So if you think about that flow from card swipe to settlement, there are a whole lot of fingers in the pie, a lot of places where the payment data resides, even if only briefly. And so that means there's a lot of attack surface, a lot of potential opportunities for insecure implementations or simple mistakes to cause a breach. And so the issuers use various techniques to fight this. They use a lot of AI. FICO is a company that sells a product called Falcon, fraud manager that's very widely used for this, but some issuers also have their own stuff. It's all top secret. They don't tell you how it works. They don't want bad guys to learn how to game it. But we've all gotten those calls from an issuer asking whether you made a particular purchase. I remember getting one last year asking if I ordered motorcycle parts from California and a sweater from the UK. No, I don't own a bike anymore. We don't buy clothes from England. So I logged on and looked at the purchase history, and I saw those two things, and also that they bought a song on iTunes for 99 cents. That let them know the card number was good without getting anybody's attention. So this data mining has been used to figure out where card numbers were skimmed also. When they get a whole bunch of complaints from geographically proximate cardholders about bogus charges, they'll look and say, where have they all shopped? Ah, look, they all went to this one particular gas station. Maybe there's a skimmer there. Just try ordering a laptop and having it sent somewhere other than your billing address. That is almost certainly going to take a call from your home phone to your bank to get the charge approved, and that makes sense. AVS is used to validate the numeric parts of your address, the street number and your zip, because they know people can't spell and people can't remember, amazingly, people can't remember whether they live on street or avenue. So just the numbers. And they do that against what they have on file. That's why the gas pump wants your zip code. And then matching last four, Staples is a store where I always come across it. They say, what are the last four on the card? Well, they're not actually supposed to ask you that. They're supposed to take the card and look at it. And the purpose of that is matching what's on the front of the card to the mag stripe to make sure it's not a forged or a repurposed card. But since the cashiers don't know why they're doing it and then just ask you for it, if you were a crook, you would just tell them the number that it's supposed to be and it would work. They also use physical features. There's the magic code, the CVV, as it's usually called, but all these names are used in various places. That is printed on the mag stripe, and the picture of a card does not let you forge the mag stripe and vice versa. So your breached information that they stole from a payments flow, from a swiped card, is not actually usable online. That's good news. Card not present transaction processed with a CVV is lower risk than one without, which is why websites still ask for it. My Citi Costco Visa has my picture on it, which is tiny and 20 years old, so I'm not sure it does any real good, but maybe it makes me happier, I'm not sure. And holograms, while not that exotic technology, aren't something you're going to cobble together at home, so they help a bit as well. Encryption is coming, more and more. This is a problem we solve here at Voltage, and PCI DSS requires it, so that's a good thing. Here's the page from a Visa guide about all the physical security features. A merchant's unlikely to use ultraviolet light to make sure the V in Visa lights up, but it's there if they want to. It's kind of interesting. You may have heard, don't sign your card, write check ID on them instead. That's actually a bad idea for a couple of reasons. First of all, an unsigned card is technically invalid. The merchant is not supposed to accept it. What they're supposed to require you to do is sign it and produce ID. Second, using an unsigned card is technically fraud, although again, you're not likely to get arrested for it. But it doesn't really make it safer because if someone steals the card, they can just sign next to check ID and now they're legit. And if somebody says, well, it says CID, they can say, check your merchant agreement. You can't ask me that, and get aggressive about it. So that's why some people think, well, I'll do both. But Visa and MasterCard say that merchant may not require ID when presented with a signed card. So the bottom line is there really isn't any point. If it's not you and the card isn't signed, they'll just sign it and say you don't need to see my ID. And to make things even more interesting, as of a couple of years ago, all the brands allow merchants to opt out to not require signatures at all. So it might not even be an issue. So EMV came in about 5 years ago after the Target breach. EMV stands for Europay, MasterCard, and Visa. It's a consortium in the industry. And it was very rare in the US until 2015. It works through a chip on the card, which gets powered by the terminal. So when you plug it in, it actually powers up the card and does some encryption, or via induction for touchless terminals. It has protective storage for the crypto keys and the like, and writable storage for things like the PIN, which is of course encrypted on the card, or how many times has this card rejected a PIN. And there's a programmed hierarchy of what are called CVMs, card validation method, and rules. So like under 20, no PIN, no signature. Over $10,000 require a blood sample, in between, and whatever in between. So the reason it took so long for EMV to take hold in the US was because the card issuers resisted it. They said it was going to be expensive to replace all the cards, which was dumb because obviously they could have just done a rolling replace, as cards expired. To the merchants to replace all the terminals, which is true, but again, that could have been done rolling. The real hammer was the Target thing. And the way they made the merchant shift was what's called the liability shift. As of October 1st, 2015, if you're a merchant and less than 3/4 of your card present transactions go through an EMV-enabled terminal, then you're on the hook for any card present fraud. If you meet that threshold, the issuer pays. So basically that allowed them to say, okay, I get a new terminal, I don't have to worry about fraud. It was also an incentive for the issuers to get the cards out to you. If you recall that time, cards got out in an awful hurry. But there are merchants that have no plans to support EMV. Small merchants may have just bought a terminal that's still good for a few years, or they're just not worried about it, like restaurants. Restaurants mostly don't care because it's just the cost of food, and most people don't use a card to go to McDonald's, a stolen card to go to McDonald's. This concept that PINs are inconvenient has been quoted. It's not quite what it sounds like. It isn't that the issuers think you as consumers are too stupid to remember a PIN. It's that they were worried that using a PIN makes the card less convenient. And there's that word again, convenience. And so with a wallet full of cards, if I've got a Visa that requires a PIN and one that doesn't, they think I'll use the one that doesn't. I'm not sure that's true, but it might be. So they saw chip and PIN as a competitive disadvantage, and that's why we only got chip and SIG, which is a shame because it's less secure. Also note that gas pumps were deferred by a couple of years from the original date, and that's unsurprising when you think about it, because gas pumps cost tens of thousands of dollars per pump, and replacing it would be a big deal. And apparently gas pump fraud isn't all that common. So they originally said 2015 or 2017, and then the gas merchants all said not going to happen. So they deferred it to 2020, which you'll notice is coming up pretty soon. I have yet to see an EMV-enabled pump, so I'm wondering if that's even going to happen. Finally, it's important to understand that EMV only helps with card present fraud, obviously, since card not present transaction doesn't involve a chip. So the norm is that as EMV is rolled out in a market, card present fraud drops and card not present goes up, and that's exactly what's happened here. I've always wondered how you get away with card not present fraud. I imagine people renting an apartment to the drop site, getting a bunch of stuff delivered and then skipping. But it turns out there's a simpler approach. They sell items on eBay that they don't actually own, sold as brand new. When you see an item on eBay that says, brand new in box, that could be somebody who's fraudulent. What they do is they've got a stolen card number. They sell you the item, then they order it using that stolen card number, have it shipped to you, and their address never touches the transaction. So they can get away with that for a while. So essentially, PayPal is laundering the stolen money for them, or PayPal and eBay, although sort of innocently. RFID and near-field communications cards are spreading. That's the same technology that your phone uses for things like Apple Pay and Android Pay. And they're nice because they're easier to use, which is, again, what the brands want. 95% of cards issued in Canada support contactless. It's a lower number here. And supposedly 8 out of 10 merchants have wireless capable terminals. SoftCard was a consortium trying to do this for all cards, sort of as a universal card. Unfortunately, they were named ISIS originally. That was a bad name, and they rebranded, but too late, and they're gone. There's a lot of FUD out there about RFID and NFC, with people thinking it's way too easy to like run a skimmer or a sensor by your wallet and steal your number, and that's possibly true, but they do use a one-time CVV. So there's one transaction they could steal, and they're also often limited by the chip in the card, by the CVM, the card validation method, to something reasonable like $20. So the amount of fraud is just not significant. If you're really paranoid, you can use a sleeve. So what can you do about it? You've likely heard all these warnings, with the possible exception of virtual credit card numbers. Some banks will let you log onto their site and get an alternative number, and you can tie that to a specific store or make it valid only for a limited time or for exactly one transaction. So if you're going to buy something from one of those sketchy gray market electronics stores in Brooklyn, this might be a good idea. That way they don't get your real number, although using PayPal probably works just as well. There are various banks that offer this, but it's not super popular. Amex used to offer it, and then they dropped it because nobody used it. You can place a 90-day fraud alert for free with the credit reporting agency and most credit card issuers if you find anything suspicious. But if you want a longer alert, that only happens once you're already breached, which is unpleasant. But many breaches result in offers of free credit card monitoring, such like LifeLock. So like Target offered that after their breach, and they had no controls over who signed up. So next time you see a big breach, if you're interested, go to that merchant's website and see if they're offering free credit monitoring, and you probably get it for free. But meanwhile, you do want to put a credit card freeze on at the credit reporting agency. It's the big three: Equifax and TransUnion, and Experian. I can never remember them for some reason. And what that means is nobody can open new credit card in your name, including you, until you turn it off. So when you go to apply for a new card, you have to turn it off temporarily and then turn it back on. That's not too bad. By the way, the 419 scam, it's called that because the Nigerian Criminal Code Article 419 covers fraud, and a lot of those scams for some reason come from Nigeria, and it goes back over a century. It used to be called the Spanish prisoner scam. That's the one where they say, I've got $3 million I need to move, and I'll give you a share for helping me move it. There's some more warning or things you can do if you're traveling internationally, also mostly just common sense. We talked about EMV. EMV may be required overseas, so you do want to have it if you're going to travel. You want to notify your card company if you're going overseas, because otherwise they may see all these charges from some other country and get suspicious and try and call you at home, and you won't be there. So giving them a warning can help. And the last item is a protection against social engineering attacks. It's good advice anywhere, but if you get called on a landline, then you want to be especially careful. My sister got a call. I'll try and keep the story short, but the upshot is that she hung up and called her card number and wound up talking to the same people because they had called her and they never hung up, right? If I call you and then you hang up and pick up again, you don't get a dial tone. You're still talking to me. And she couldn't swear that she heard a dial tone because with cell phones, we don't listen for them anymore. But they could have faked the dial tone until they heard her start dialing too. So fortunately, she didn't get scammed because she got suspicious. But it's a nice little scam, and I found a document on the web, so it wasn't just her. So it's tempting if you're a company to say, well, we're a small company, chances are we won't get attacked. As with any security issue, more realistic approach is not if, but when. Walmart is attractive to attackers because they've got lots of stuff to steal, but they're also more aware of that and they spend a lot on security. That corner store doesn't really have anything to steal online, so they're not much of a target. I think it's the mid-size who are the biggest risk because they're soft targets, but they have something enough to be worth attacking. This statement from the DNI was kind of interesting. He was testifying to Congress about national security and said, when it comes to distinct threat areas, our statement this year leads with cyber, and it's hard to overemphasize its significance. And finally, this diagram, which I obviously stole from the web, shows the top countries back in 2013. Yay, we're #1. And there's a link there to the discussion of this. I can't find a later version of this, but it's probably the same. So if you do get breached, it isn't just the cleanup you have to deal with. There can be fines from the card brands, PCI fines. There are fines from the government sometimes. And that's a whole nother minefield. This whole online fraud thing is evolving so fast that the laws can't keep up. And so there's some very arbitrary looking fines that have come down. It's been very unpleasant for companies. And of course, when a breach does become public, people blame the company. People were swearing, I'll never shop at Target again. Of course they did, but it did cost Target. So if you process or store credit card numbers for your business, you need to pay attention to PCI DSS and encryption. I happen to think, our product Secure Data is best for that, but I would. There are lots of products out there that solve the problem. If your business has stores with POS devices, think about end-to-end encryption. That's encrypting the data when it's swiped, passing it all the way through the system so that the acquirer doesn't even have to be part of that understanding. That, as far as I can tell, it looks like a credit card number. Again, we do that. On the web, end-to-end encryption is a good thing. You can encrypt in the web page so that there's no opportunity short of a compromised machine, local machine, for that to happen. But as with any strategy, it should be unified with a SOC and a SIM and all that stuff. So we're doing all this stuff, right? Payments isn't a high-risk technology like a plane crash, but many breaches act like they are. They result not from a single security hole, but a series of cascading events. This hole allowed that exploit, which was not noticed when it should have been because of this other problem, and the breach data shouldn't have even been where it was anyway. So we're doing all these things. So is Target, so are all the other victims, and we keep spending more on security. Are we winning? No, doesn't feel like it. This book that I referenced at the bottom here is quite interesting. As you can see, it's quite old. It talks a lot about 3 Mile Island, but then he goes on to talk about how the Russian nuclear plant design means the 3 Mile Island accident would probably be much worse, predating Chernobyl by 2 years, and how we can expect even Western designs to have problems. And he describes this scenario that sounds an awful lot like the Japanese Fukushima meltdown. So let's leap out of IT and look at a normal accident, the plane crash of Air France 447. That was an Airbus that was lost heading east from Brazil back in 2009. So they're flying along and the autopilot disengaged. And the pilot on duty didn't understand that, which points to a training issue. But the first directive, if you're a pilot or know any pilots, is fly the plane, right? Aviate, navigate, communicate in that order. So he flies the plane. In doing so, he overcorrects a bit and starts climbing. And the pitot tubes are iced up, which means his instruments say he's going faster and faster. So he climbs more to try and bleed off some speed. Stall warnings go off, but the stall warning was disabled because of the autopilot disengagement. And due to the incorrect instrument readings, he basically kept stalling the plane all the way into the water. And by this point, all 3 of the crew in the cockpit are talking, saying what's going on, why doesn't this make any sense? And it was dark, they couldn't tell, and they basically flew the plane into the water. So if you change any one of those, any one of that cascade, 228 people live. So Target was similar. There was an HVAC contractor that was legitimately given credentials to log on to part of the Target network. Somehow that HVAC contractor got breached. The network wasn't properly segmented, so the bad guys could get from the breach segment onto the secure segment. They infected the POS terminal load with malware, and it then obligingly transferred that all to the terminals. They did have a SIM in place, they did have monitoring in place, it sent all these monitoring warnings, but their attitude was, yeah, it always says that. We're getting thousands of these warnings all the time. And because the card data wasn't encrypted, tens of millions of cards were breached. So again, you change any one of those in the sequence and there's no breach. So I've been to several meetings where people talked about the importance of making contact with your local police or RCMP or FBI or Secret Service now. If you get breached, it may well be that law enforcement notices before you do. And would you rather have a bunch of guys with guns show up at reception and say, get someone down here now, or would you rather get a call from Bob with whom you've shared a beer saying, hey, I think you've got a problem, you need to alert the troops to implement your breach plan. And don't ignore things like the legal issues. When the cops show up and start telling you to shut things down, or perhaps equally likely not to shut them down because they want to track the bad guys while they're still in your system, you want to have it already worked out whether you have to listen to them or not. Midnight on a Saturday is not the time to be trying to contact your general counsel to ask those questions. And of course, this isn't just an issue for the programming team or one applications team or information security. It's a cross-team issue. You need to have people who've worked together on simulated breaches, deciding what systems are most critical, what you can shut down and what you can't, and so on. And if you're wondering why I say National Guard, that probably doesn't matter for payments, but it does for if you're involved in infrastructure like a utility, it might, or a bank. There have been denial of service attacks against bank. Can you imagine if Citibank or Chase were to be shut down for a week? That would get real ugly. So what about Target? I talked about how that happened. It's still interesting to look at what was stolen and how. The breach was in the POS, so they got all the track information on the mag stripes. This includes the CVV1, which is the one that's on the mag stripe, not the one on the card. They got the red card numbers. Those actually weren't at risk because they're protected by a PIN that's decrypted in the POS. But when people called Target and said, I want a new red card, Target made things worse by saying, you don't need to worry about that, making people think that Target was lying to them. They should have just said fine and replaced them. Marriott was exceptional in that it went on for 4 years before they noticed it. That's bad. eBay was really a non-event. It was salted and hashed passwords, which aren't really, are essentially zero risk. But they recommended you change your password anyway, probably just so they could say, we did something. OPM breach got some biometric data. That's nasty because you can't change that. You can't change your fingerprint. You can't change your retina. And Sony was huge, huge amount of data. I was actually surprised this didn't turn out to be a bigger deal than it did. It was 6 years ago now, and it had data from important people, not you and me, but directors and movie stars and people like that. And the industry kind of went, meh. And then finally, Equifax. We've all heard about it, and it seems to have been just inexcusably poor systems management plus what I call big company problems. They had a system for notifying people who used Apache Struts, which was just the compromised software that caused the breach. Notifying people who used that there was a breach and or a weakness, a vulnerability, and they didn't do something. Unfortunately, of course, that mailing list wasn't up to date, which if you work in a big company, is a chronic problem. And then after the breach happened, alerts were being sent out, but there was an expired certificate, and so they weren't delivered. And so this went on for 18 months, and finally one day somebody noticed that the certificate was expired. They replaced the cert, and all of a sudden, things turned red with alerts. A little late. So we keep seeing these breaches hit the news, and obviously people freak out. We talked about Target and people saying they'll never shop there again, but they do. Target claimed the claims of Target kept changing. First they said it was 40 million, then they said it was more, and people got upset about that. That probably wasn't their fault, right? They probably didn't know until they did more investigation how many it was. And I even questioned that 40 million. They probably meant 40 million transactions were at risk, but presumably there were some duplicate card numbers in there. I doubt they took the 40 million numbers, collected them all, and sorted them and deleted duplicates before they said 40 million. So where's all this going? We've seen a tremendous evolution since those early paper cards. This is a list of a bunch of startups doing stuff in the payments arena. It's not current. It was I put this together a couple of years ago, and I'm certainly not going to talk about them, but you can see there's a lot of them. There's a lot of money there. It's other people's money, the best kind, so everybody wants a piece of it. We have folks taking payments through all sorts of alternative methods, Square and Friends, various different kinds of terminals, Apple Pay, Google Pay, Samsung Pay, which I like very much. I use Apple Pay or Android Pay all the time. Without getting off on a tangent, all security is just a matter of putting up barriers, right? In security, we talked about adding another turtle, based on the old story about the world sitting on a turtle and back another turtle and so on. So the more turtles, the greater security, as each turtle adds some protection. So these whatever pay, Apple Pay, Google Pay, Samsung Pay, are actually more secure because they add a turtle. They abstract your payment method into a token that lives in the phone. So if you lose your phone, or your number gets breached, you can kill that token, and now it's harmless. And you can even deposit checks now using your smartphone. If you're old enough, you remember the scramble on Fridays to get to the bank and get cash for the weekend. Now you don't even have to go there to deposit checks. We already talked about the big brands starting at the bank level. Now we're seeing consolidation. All these different methods. I won't talk about these companies except to mention Klinkle, which is possibly the stupidest name ever for a company. They had some idea of consolidating all your payments into a single card, which sounds like a bad idea, and they ran out of money and went away. But if you Google them, it's kind of an interesting story. So there's all these acquisitions happening. And last year, Vantiv got bought by WorldPay, who then got bought by FIS. WorldPay also bought a couple others. First Data got bought by Fiserv. Elavon got bought by Global Payments. So the number of big acquirers is reducing. Obviously, there's somebody next in size behind Elavon in 2020, but they're not a big player. So I don't know if that consolidation is a bad idea. Hard to believe it's very good. But as payments protection gets more sophisticated, so do the crackers. There's tons of data in merchant systems, especially big data, stored in website, in Walmart's system, in your insurance company's database. And attacking it is risk-free if you're sitting overseas, especially. So they do hack away and they monetize it. They sell stolen credit card numbers online. A stolen credit card number is worth $2 to $5 online, which is not a lot of money. So why is there so much action in the payment space? Well, to make money, but a lot of these startups are there to reduce friction, to make it easier, which equals greater uptake and therefore success. I do a presentation for Career Day at the middle school in technology. One of the things I point out is how much everyday life has changed in such a short time, even if to the kids some of it's pretty obvious. And that when they're my age, they will have seen changes at least as great, probably greater. But why can't I start my car with my phone? Why do I need a wallet with a bunch of cards and some printed pieces of paper with dead people on them? Obviously, that's the question Apple Pay and Google Pay and company are asking too. Sweden has gone on to an almost entirely cashless society. People using cash there are looked down upon as if they're doing something illegitimate. And the Wall Street Journal had a front page article asking if we should go to a cashless society, so people here are at least thinking about it. So simple is good, but of course all this also enables analytics and tracking. I'm sure the 3- and 4-letter agencies would love for us all to use our phones for everything so that they could subpoena that data and track us in more detail. Google has a system called Lures that lets law enforcement ask for a list of all Android phones in a given location at a given time. And Apple probably has something similar. And the Snowden leaks revealed that even 5 years ago, there was a pilot tracking program with one of the security agencies tracking travelers' phones through the use of free airport Wi-Fi. If you think about it, the fact that the Constitution applies to the government but not to private industry means it's easy to see that as your phone does more and more of everything, it easily becomes your de facto national ID without that pesky Constitution getting in the way. So on that note, I could go on for another hour here. We've barely scratched the surface. Glenbrook Partners is a consulting firm in the payment space. They publish an excellent, if expensive, $50 for 150 pages book called Payment Systems in the US, and they have a 2-day boot camp. That 1.5 trillion in US card spending is a drop in the bucket next to the vast amounts of money transferred between businesses. A single small Citigroup location that I know of processes about $2 billion a day in one location. That's just inter-business transfer. So, there's a lot more money in payments behind just cards. But the bottom line is if, or maybe when you get breached, it's how you deal with it that matters. And I know we all say don't use Wikipedia as a primary source, but the Wikipedia pages on payments, on credit cards, debit cards, and all that are actually pretty good. So I've gone a little over time here. I appreciate your patience. I appreciate your attention. And here's my information. If you have questions, I'm always happy to answer them. And let's see if we got some questions in the chat.
Thanks,
Rocky?
Phil. Boy, that was awesome. I mean, I never knew that much about the process, but thanks for detailing that all out. And my question would be, or one of the questions that I'm seeing is, should I avoid shopping at stores that only swipe my card?
A good question. Probably not. I mean, you probably shouldn't avoid it because they're the ones at the risk for fraud, thanks to the liability shift. And the bottom line on card fraud is that I don't know anybody who's ever actually lost any money to it. In theory, you're liable for the first $50, but I've never heard of a card company saying you paid that $50. Now, I can surmise that if you were a lousy customer, if you were behind in your payments and owed them $30,000, they might try and tack that $50 on as, hey, we're going to get what we can out of this deadbeat. But I guess I don't know anybody who's that much of a deadbeat, and I've never actually heard of that happening. That's just a guess. So no, I wouldn't worry about that.
Okay. And another question came up is, how can you protect yourself against a card scammer?
Skimmer.
Sorry.
Yeah. Also a good question. It's certainly being, looking around. If things look funny on the terminal, or not terminal, on the ATM or whatever, it's certainly legitimate to go and pull on something that looks like it's loose. If it comes off, go inside the bank and say, hey, is this yours? Look for a camera, cover the pin pad. There are Bluetooth applications, Bluetooth apps you can put on your phone that will look for Bluetooth, because one of the ways that scammers get the data out of the terminal, out of the ATM or terminal, is through Bluetooth. They'll have Bluetooth in their skimmer, and then they just drive up in a car and download the data. So you might be able to see that. I know some people who have the app. I've never bothered to load it, and I asked them, and they all said, yeah, I've never actually found one. It doesn't mean it's a bad idea. No, it doesn't mean it's a bad idea, but when you look at the fact that you're probably not on the hook for most fraud anyway, it's probably not a big deal. Now, debit card fraud, is a bigger risk, because if they empty your account, you're going to have to fight with the bank over actual money, which is one reason I never use debit. If my account got emptied over debit, I would go to the bank and say, guys, look, I never use debit. You didn't give me an option to turn off debit. So you need to make good on this. And maybe I would prevail, maybe not. Some people have, some people haven't. I'm a pretty good bank customer, so I suspect they would, but who knows?
So from a Micro Focus user community of Vivit, and I'm an end user in a large company, I'm in the security space. What is the value that Micro Focus is bringing to the table?
Well, we offer lots of encryption options, ranging from encrypting in the web page all the way through to the processor, or in the terminal all the way through the processor, to encrypting in the enterprise with format preserving data protection, which means that the protected data still looks like the original, which means that most of your applications don't actually need to change. If you consider a social security number, you don't ever care what my social is. You care that you have it, that it's consistent, that it looks like a social, and that if you need to pass it to, say, a credit agency for a credit check, that you can decrypt it or detokenize it in that case. But otherwise, you never care what it is. So if you protect it, as soon as you touch it, then it can live 99.9% of the time within your enterprise. It can even be a primary key as its encrypted form, and there's no risk to somebody stealing it.
So what solutions are we looking at specifically for Micro Focus?
Voltage secure data.
Okay, is it one product? Is it a number of modules?
It's the family of products.
Okay.
Yep. And voltage.com will get you there in a hurry.
Perfect. No, that's great. I think that's all our questions, Phil, but that was a great presentation. So thank you. And just to let our SIG members know that if they're in, looks like German, there is an event coming up from a lug perspective, a real meeting in person. So if you're in this area, click on the link and it'll guide you to that lug event. So that's something that's coming up. And let's see if there's anything else here in the wings. So just go ahead and move the next slide.
Trying to, it's not there. Fine, it wasn't going.
There we go. I guess we don't, but we do have a survey, a short survey that if you can fill out. It'd be great for our leaders to kind of get the feedback from you, and that way we can make sure that we provide the content in these SIG events that are relevant to you. So if there's something that you want to know more about or shared, please, add that to the survey. And I think with that, if there's no other slides, Phil, I think we're done.
It's a wrap.
So thank you very much. That was very informative, and look forward to seeing you down the road.
Thank you, Rocky. Good to see you. I'm going to talk to you.
All right, take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.